Hey guys, welcome to another edition, another episode of Capturing Christianity. And if you don't know what the ministry is all about, we are aimed at exposing the intellectual side of Christian belief. And what I've been doing for the last, I guess it's been about a year now, been hosting discussions between Christians and non-Christians. And today we have two Christians talking about a really interesting doctrine called Molinism. We want to ask, is Molinism true? That's the topic that we're discussing today. So I've invited John Limanto. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Is that right? Just give me a nod.
Actually, it's Limanto.
Limanto. Okay. Well, John Limanto, he's the writer to three different ministries: Free Thinking Ministries, The Art of Rigor, and Faithful Apologetics. He's a local Christian apologist in Indonesia, and he's resided for 7 years in, I'm going to mispronounce all of these, Borneo?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And Jakarta?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And he's pursuing his researches on Molinism and studies at Pelita Harapan.
That's correct too. Don't worry.
Okay.
Don't worry.
All right, good. And so in addition to John, I have Andrew here with me. And he lives in Auckland, New Zealand. And you'll hear that in his accent. It's pretty gnarly. So he's a self-described career student. And he has an undergraduate and 2 postgraduate degrees in philosophy from the University of Auckland. And he's nearing the completion of his 4th degree, an LLB in law. I have no idea what that means, but I'm sure it's really fancy and like it's a big deal. It's really cool. So
an LLB is just the equivalent of a JD. Essentially, it's just that it's done at an undergraduate level, ostensibly.
Got it.
Otherwise.
Got it. Well, it's pretty specific. It's pretty cool. I'm sure you're learning a lot about law there. So what got you interested in law, if you don't mind me asking before we begin?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, there was a certain practical intention in it as well. I mean, I knew that I loved philosophy, but having done philosophy, but I also knew that, in terms of, getting a job, supporting a family and so forth, getting a job in philosophy, the chances of getting a job in philosophy in New Zealand were slim to none. And I sort of looked at law a bit like doing practical philosophy. It's just that the sources of your premises come from case law and statutes rather than perhaps from, the sciences or from reflecting on intuitions or something like that. So I suppose that's how I would think of law, is it's doing philosophy just in a really, really applied way. So it was a way of doing what I loved, namely philosophy, but doing it in a way that meant that I would be able to support myself and support any family that I might end up having in the future. So that I suppose was how I really got into studying law specifically.
I mean, that's a pretty good reason.
Yeah, that's really why. Yeah.
Cool. Well, hey, so if you guys want to learn more about my guests, go to capturingchristianity.com. I have their stuff on the website, and that's also where you can go to find all the social media links to Facebook, Twitter, and also the podcast. If you didn't know, we have a podcast and we update it as often as we can, about every 2 weeks or so. Sometimes it's a little bit longer, but we're hoping to take that down as we can get up some more donations and contributions from you guys on patreon.com. If you want to help support us and make sure that the content that we're producing is consistently being put out, not only consistently being put out, but putting a lot of it out. I mean, we're already putting out a lot, but we could be doing a whole lot more. So patreon.com/capturingchristianity is the place to go if you want to do that. And then just the website, capturingchristianity.com for everything else. So with that out of the way, I already said thanks to you guys for coming on. I'm really excited about this one. Molinism is a subject that I personally have not really done a whole lot of research or I've done a little bit. Okay, so I haven't read any books on it. I've listened to pretty much all of William Lane Craig's lectures in his Defender series on the topic. And so anytime I hear about it being mentioned, I'm like, yeah, that seems like a plausible view to me. And so I know that it's actually really contentious in the literature. It's like It's a very controversial view. And maybe if you're a Molinist out there, you're leaning toward Molinism, maybe you don't know that, but now you do. It's a controversial issue. And that's why we're debating it today. Christians disagree about it. So, and it's okay for us to disagree on these sort of side doctrines, right? We can have these kind of internal discussions. There's no problem there. And we're going to do it in a Christ-like manner. I mean, we're all Christians here. We're not going to be, well, I guess we can't throw things at each other because it's all on the internet. But anyways, let's get into the meat. I want to go to John first, and I want to ask you, so the topic is Molinism true? And so I want to hear some of your reasons why your answer to that is yes.
Okay, so first, I think we have to know that when I say that Molinism is true and I have a proof for Molinism, I don't mean that I have a knockdown argument for Molinism, as in many other areas of philosophy and clearly enough in science as well. But what I mean is that Molinism should be adopted as something that is plausible and probable given its explanatory power in explaining and reconciling various doctrines of Christianity. And I have in mind clearly enough the doctrine of human free will and the doctrine of divine providence. And perhaps if you're more into theology, then it will be the doctrine of predestination, the doctrine of prayers, and all of these other things. And I think, so that will be my first argument, namely that Molinism provides great explanatory power, and that in the absence of overwhelming defeaters, we should adopt Molinism as the model that is more probable. Now, my second argument is a lot simpler than my first. My second argument is simply that if you believe in the existence of what's called as the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, that is to say, subjunctive conditionals about what every free libertarian creatures would do in any possible circumstances. So that is to say, the proposition of the form if given a circumstance, then a person would do something. If you believe that there are these true propositions, then by virtue of God's omniscience, God should be able to know these propositions. And so it seems that it's highly intuitive at the very least for all of us to suppose that counterfactuals are true. But I would like to go even further than that and say that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which involve libertarian free will, is true, which then should already entail that God must possess this knowledge by virtue of his omniscience.
Great. So those are two arguments, right? First, at the outset. Did you have any more that you wanted to add, or are you okay to sort of go into those right now?
I would say I don't want to go off to other arguments. I would say I would rather focus on those two in this dialogue.
Okay, so before I bring you in, Andrew, I know you're like chomping at the bits to get in here. I just want to provide some clarity about these two arguments so that before we get into them, we make sure and we all understand, including the people watching, we understand the view being espoused here, the arguments themselves. So the first one is from explanatory power. And you say that, well, help me actually understand this, because I want to understand what the argument here is. Because you're saying that you're pointing at two different doctrines: the doctrine of free will, humans have free will, and then you're also saying God has divine foreknowledge. And you're saying Molinism helps us to combine these two doctrines together. Is that what you're saying, or are you saying something different?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if what you're trying to bring me into is trying to explain Molinism, then I would say that in Molinism, it's really not just God's foreknowledge, but God knows, God can operate based on what he knows every free creature would do in different circumstances. And so in that sense, then it's not just his foreknowledge that he knows after he makes a decision, but he makes a decision based on all these different contingencies on what every free creature would have really done. And so God, theoretically speaking, would have absolute providence over his creation, and at the same time creatures would be fully free in the libertarian sense without impeding any part of their libertarian free will, if I'm understanding your question correctly there.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to understand the first argument, because it was from explanatory power, and you said from this it's more probably true. Now the second argument that you gave was from subjunctive conditionals. And I love that term, but I'm afraid that people watching may not be super familiar with it. And so you explained it a little bit, but I just want to get clear on what we mean by this. And you're saying that basically, well, here's the way that Craig often puts it, is that it's knowledge about what a person would do if he was placed in some circumstance. And so it's actually, I think, easier to grasp this if we use some concrete examples. So, for instance, Pontius Pilate, the guy who condemned Jesus to death, he was the Roman I forget his title, but God knew, apparently, if these subjunctive conditionals are true, then God would have known that Pontius Pilate put in that situation, he knew that he would condemn Jesus to death. Okay, if there are these subjunctive conditionals about facts about what we would freely do if put in these different situations. And so when we say these big words like subjunctive conditionals, we're just talking about facts about what a free person would freely do in some situation. And so we can also think about, here's one more easy example, when Peter denied Jesus 3 times. If we assume that this was a free thing, like Peter wasn't forced to deny Jesus 3 times, he could have denied him twice, only once, 4 times, 5 times. So if this was a free act on Peter's part, then we want to ask, did God know that if he put Peter in that situation, then he would have denied him 3 times? And so I think that's sort of the idea here. And if the second argument is that if there are these kind of statements, these subjunctive conditionals, which there's no debate over whether or not there are these statements, but the question is, are these true statements? And I'm sure that Andrew, when he comes in, he's going to have something to say about that. So we want to ask, are these true statements? And the second argument, I take it, is pretty straightforward. If these are true, then in virtue of God's omniscience, he has to know them, and Molinism is therefore basically true. But so I think that if you're good with that explanation of your second argument, I'd like to go back to the first because I'm still sort of iffy on that one.
Okay, I just want to add up one more thing as well about subjunctive conditionals. The reason why we use the word subjunctive is that, of course, in literature, when we're talking about counterfactuals being statements about non-existent facts in reality, the reason why we use the word subjunctive conditional to begin with is because we're not talking about everything that's not in reality, because we're also talking about things that are in reality, such as, for example, if Peter had been with Jesus, he would have denied him 3 times. That's a true proposition. And so that's the reason why we, although we call that counterfactuals of Christian freedom, we qualify it and say, oh, what we mean actually involve all subjunctive conditionals, whether they have true antecedents or no, or whether they have false antecedents.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's helpful. So last point of clarification, and then we're going to bring in Andrew here. So back to that first argument from explanatory power. Just walk me through that one more time, and then we'll just hand it over to Andrew.
Okay, so think about, for example, competing hypotheses in science. For example, in competing hypotheses between different models of cosmology. And I don't claim to be a cosmologist myself, but we know that in judging whether one data should be adjudicated as more probable than the other, then what we do is that we take all the data that's presented before us, the data being, for example, all the research is done and all the numerical data as well, and then you see which of the model actually explains all of the data in their own merits. That is to say that the data does not, you don't have to resort to positing other entities or other contrived theories in relation to that model. And so a model is said to be simple when it can make sense of the data without you having to appeal to creating postulating other entities or other theories that are contrived. And so in the same way, when we're applying that to Molinism, what we're saying is that when we take all the biblical data, take for example the biblical data that God is a fully provident God, or that humans are genuinely responsible for their actions, and we take even philosophical data as well about what it means for somebody to be responsible and what it means for whether or not God is responsible for the sins of the humanity. In what sense are these data? I would say they are, in the full sense, they're data that we have to analyze. And so in order, my point is that in order for you to say that one model adjudicates should be adjudicated as the more probable than the other, what you need to be able to demonstrate is that it actually makes sense of all these different data that we have, in this case being the biblical data, but also perhaps the philosophical data as well from the various philosophical arguments. And I find that Molinism, out of all the other views out there, make the most sense of, for example, how humans can be genuinely free in the libertarian sense. And I believe that libertarian free will, based on the philosophical data, is the more superior form of free will, and that Molinism also allows for God to be fully sovereign, even in the face of human libertarian free choice. And in that sense, that it makes sense of all the other data that we have, for example, from prayers and from predestination, perhaps, and from the doctrine of, well, just take any doctrine from the Bible that involves human libertarian free will, perhaps even from the problem of evil, you can make sense of the problem of evil. And so I find that in the end of the day, this explanatory power, it makes Molinism more probable and more plausible.
So I'm wondering to myself if I'm ever going to bring Andrew in, and I am. I'm going to do that right now. Well, Andrew, take your mic off mute, and let's talk about. Well, okay, let me ask you what you want to do. Do you want to talk about his two arguments, or do you want to sort of answer the question yourself and then go from there?
Well, okay, so I mean, there are a couple of things that sort of got raised, which is, you know, firstly, John's argument, your argument from explanatory power, which the idea is that Molinism has better explanatory power. So there's that on the one hand. The second point is an argument from the existence of true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom to Molinism. And we'll put a pin in both of those, and I'll sort of circle back, because I want to take the time sort of really briefly just to be quite explicit about what I understand Molinism to actually be, partly because that really informs my response to, especially to the argument from true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, because I'm not convinced by the inference there are true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, therefore Molinism. But I mean, how do you feel about that, Cameron? Do you think we should just take a moment to be clear about what Molinism is? So maybe I'll actually punt this back to you, John, and maybe do you want to give us a definition of how you understand, of what you understand Molinism to be?
Okay. Actually, I think I will take that. So let me just make this clear again. Especially, well, first and foremost, I think I would have to make it clear that Molinism is not a systematic theology, and that's something that me and Andrew, I presume, can agree on. And so when I say that Molinism is true, I am really just arguing for the bare bones, or what someone like Trim Stratton calls as the mere Molinism from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. That is to say, how you can hold to Molinism with the least amount of philosophical commitments. And here are the two commitments that you have to hold to be a Molinist. And as long as you hold to these two, then you become a Molinist. So the first, of course, is that God possesses knowledge about these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. But of course, that is perhaps not clear enough, and I would like to say that these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom were not determined by God in their true values, and therefore they exist as contingent facts about reality. And not just that, but these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom were also known pre-volitionally, that is to say, known prior to any creative decree by God. Before God decreed anything, logically prior, God knew these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. And I can explain more if you want me to, but the second commitment is actually implied by the first commitment, and the second commitment is that libertarian free will is true. And libertarian free will here, I take it simply in its bare bone definition too, namely that determinism, causal determinism, and libertarian and free will, genuine free will, are incompatible, and that second, determinism is false, and that third, free will exists. So in short, I'm just saying that as long as you have free will that is not determinism, and that free will is incompatible with determinism, and that free will exists, anything that falls under that is libertarian free will. And so that's all I mean when I talk about Molinism, and I hope that I'm giving a solid enough background for you all to work with.
Yeah. So what you actually said there was really interesting, John. So you said that you focused on what William Lane Craig calls middle knowledge, right? So this idea that there are these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, and the key bit there, the key bit to being a Molinist, is that these are, as it were, an object of God's middle knowledge, right? So this is the key bit about what it takes to be a Molinism, is that you're postulating that these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are an object of God's middle knowledge. And I like to think about it, and this is, I suppose, for the benefit of the viewers as well, I like to think about it in terms of where it stands, where God's knowledge stands in relation to his creative decree. So there are certain propositions that God knows because he has made them to be true. So for instance, Andrew Harland-Smith exists is a proposition God knows to be true, but that knowledge is, he has that knowledge because he decided to make it so, right? Whereas there's certain propositions, namely, in at least in your view, about how we would act in any given any given set of circumstances, which are, and these propositions, the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, are prior to God's creative decree, right?
Yeah.
God does not know them because he has made them to be true, right? They are prior to his creative decree. Okay, I think that's a really key point for my purposes, because I don't reject the existence of true counterfactuals, right? And that's one thing to be clear about. Like, this is why I don't necessarily follow the inference from true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom to therefore Molinism. I would have more said that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, that these are actually more an object of God's free knowledge. Now that's contentious in its own right. I mean, Cameron, you sort of said at the beginning that Molinism is a contentious issue. Well, yeah, I mean, pretty much anything on this in the vicinity here is contentious. So yeah, I don't reject the existence of true counterfactuals. I just don't see the inference to therefore Molinism, right? I mean, how do we feel about that? Sorry, I keep getting sidetracked. But how do we feel about that definition of middle knowledge, that the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are prior to God's creative decree? Can we agree on that?
That's certainly one attribute of middle knowledge, and I can agree that that's true.
You said something, Andrew. You said something interesting, that you were talking about how God knows that Andrew exists because he made it so. And then when it comes to subjunctive conditionals about what we would do if placed in certain situations, circumstances, what's the point that you were making there about, like, God knows that because he made it so?
I was just trying to clarify the nature of what it is that we're saying, what it takes to be a Molinist. So there are certain propositions that God knows because he's made them so. So Andrew exists because he's made it so, right? When you're a Molinist, what you're saying is that the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are not like that, right? These are not an object of God's free knowledge. They're an object of God's middle knowledge. So that is to say that God knows certain propositions but not because he has made them true. I think William Lane Craig uses the example of like an infallible barometer. So it reads the weather, but it doesn't make the weather the case, right? So it's sunny outside, so the barometer needle would be pointing one way, but it's not like the needle is actually making it to be the case that it's sunny outside, right? It's just reporting on what it quote unquote perceives.
Well, can I clarify on one point there just real quick?
Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Okay, yeah. I just wasn't too comfortable, especially with the language of what the barometer receives. I mean, for the sake of analogy, I take that that's a valid analogy. But of course, there's a temptation here in saying, in just resolving the debate by saying, well, God knows his knowledge from his creatures. God, so to say, looks into the future to all these different realities, and he receives information from him looking at these different realities and gaining knowledge from there. Somehow God was able to gain knowledge outside from himself, and so he's in the receiving end. And I just want to make this a point that's real quick as well, that someone like William Lane Craig would not say that God is in the receiving end in the sense of God looking in the future and then God gaining his knowledge from the creatures. In fact, it wasn't the creatures who determined the knowledge of these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom themselves, but rather these knowledge were just known because God knew it innately. And of course, the analogy that William Lane Craig likes to give is in terms of Plato's way of education, where people sort of regain a recollection because of them innately knowing within them these set of true propositions. And in the same way, I just want to clarify that the mechanism of God knowing these counterfactual of creaturely freedom is not by learning from the creatures. That's not what Molinists would say.
All right, I want to go back to, you did mention this, Andrew, that you didn't see how, because you agreed that there are true subjunctive conditionals, and that's a term that we're going to have to use. So anyways, so all right, so you agree that there are these true subjunctive conditionals about what we would do in various situations. So, but then you said, well, I don't see how that sort of leads to Molinism, right? So maybe we can get John to give that argument one more time so that we can all be clear about how that is supposed to lead to Molinism, because that was his second argument.
Yeah. I think first and foremost, I sense or I suspect that there is a confusion here with regards to the word or to the phrase counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. I will rather use the abbreviation there of CCFs. So remember that when Molinists talk about these CCFs, we don't just mean any subjunctive conditional or any counterfactual, but it's exclusively used by Molinists to denote counterfactuals or subjunctive conditionals that refer to, first, the antecedent, which is the circumstance. So if you start the proposition with if, ... the first antecedent there starts with a maximal circumstances, a maximal state of affairs until a point in time, and then the agent by libertarian free will will freely do something. And so I think that this implies Molinism, because that's all it takes to be a Molinist, is for you to believe in counterfactual of creaturely freedom in the sense implied, or in the sense at least demanded by Molinists. So of course, if you say that I don't see subjunctive conditionals as necessarily implying Molinism, well, yeah, not all subjunctive conditionals are clearly CCFs in the sense that's stipulated by Molinists. But when Molinists talk about CCFs, what we mean are exclusively these pre-volitional knowledge that God possesses of what every possible free libertarian creatures would do in any possible circumstances with their libertarian free will, as I already mentioned. And I think admitting this would, in a direct sense, make you a Molinist.
So let's talk about conditional statements for just a brief second, and then Andrew, you can come back in, because you mentioned antecedent. And so with a conditional statement, you have an if. It's an if then statement, right? And so on the left hand side, if you want to think about it as like an equation, on the left hand side is the if part, which is the antecedent, and then the then part is the consequent. That's what sort of follows from this if statement. So explain this one more time, and maybe if not just for me, then the listeners. Explain what you mean by this CCF. On the one hand, like what's included in the antecedent, and then what's included in the consequent of these conditionals.
Yeah. So first, I think it's we already established earlier that a conditional is in the form of if and then a then. So if given something, then something else will happen. That's a conditional. So, and when we use subjunctive conditional, when we use that term, then we mean the term, the same phrase, but using its subjunctive mood. And I will explain why this is important. And in the antecedent, we claim that whatever is in this antecedent is a maximal state of affairs. That is to say, a logically consistent maximal amount of state of affairs until a particular point in time before I do the action. So suppose that I have a CCF in the form of if C, then person P will do X. What's included in C is not just one piece of information, such as being born in Indonesia, where I am, but it's including everything up until the point right before the person does X, the action X there. And so
let's bring this back if we can to a more concrete example of like let's apply this to the Peter denying Jesus. So just explain for us what that would look like if we're thinking about the subjunctive conditional related to Peter denying Jesus.
Right. Well, it may have been the case that I could formulate the same counterfactual that I formulated earlier, namely that if Peter had been a follower of Jesus, then he would have denied him 3 times. Now, but remember, within this particular CCL, we're only mentioning one piece of information within the antecedent. That is to say that Peter if Peter had been a disciple of Jesus. But then suppose that in itself is not enough. Or that is to say that if Peter had suppose that Peter had been a disciple of Jesus, but he had been born to different parents, then perhaps the consequent may not have followed. And so what we need to state then, theoretically speaking, within the conditional is everything about Peter's life. So where he was born and where he was raised and his parents and all of these other events in his earlier life. And it comes up to this one moment right before he denies Jesus 3 times. And at that point in time, then we will say that at that point, we would say that the consequent follows, not in the sense of logically entailing, but in the sense of that the antecedent leads to the consequent. And the antecedent in the concrete example I'm giving is, of course, in terms of every event in Peter's life that then involves Peter denying Jesus 3 times. Is that clear enough, or do I need to?
No, I think it helps. Okay. And so I wanted to turn to Andrew now. And where do you want to go from here?
I mean, so I would just clarify the nature of I don't like the term subjunctive conditional just because it sounds really pretentious to me. I'm sorry, that's not a slight on you guys. I suppose a really simple way of thinking about a conditional is, again, like if A, then B, right? So on the one hand, A is the antecedent, B is the consequent. B is the thing said to follow from A, right? Now, a counterfactual is just a conditional of the same sort. It's just where A does not represent an actual state of affairs. So, for instance, if Hillary Clinton had won the presidential election, right, then, I don't know, bad things would have happened if you're a Trumpist. I don't know. I'm just being facetious, but that's an example of a counterfactual. That's an example of framing a conditional in, as you said, John, its subjunctive mood. Having said that, I'd still like to sort of push you to spell out the nature of this inference from true counterfactuals if creaturely freedom. I mean, yeah, because that's a fair qualification. What you said is that we're not just focusing on true counterfactuals. Generally, we're focusing on true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So, again, I say, yeah, sure, there are true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, but that they are an object of God's free knowledge. That is, God knows them because he has made them to be true, not they are not pre-volitional. So I still think just because you have true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, it does not in and of itself obvious. It's not obvious unless you sort of already assume in advance, in which case you're sort of begging the question that it's a feature of God's middle knowledge, that it's pre-volitional, right?
No, but I remember that when we say the reason why we posit that the knowledge is pre-volitional is precisely to maintain libertarian free will. Because I think that if you have a counterfactual of creaturely freedom, not in the sense that Molinism endorses it, but in the sense that God determines the outcomes and the true value, then you literally just have determinism. And so, no, I think if you admit that this is about creaturely libertarian freedom, that is to say, what creature would freely do in the libertarian sense, then you would have to say that this is pre-volitional. I don't see a way around it. And if you claim that that my definition previously was right, then of course you would be a Molinist, because all the requirements were already fulfilled, including the libertarian free will and also the contingency and the pre-volitional nature that supports the libertarian free will. Or am I missing something here that I haven't explained?
No. That's okay. I mean, what you said was really interesting though, because you sort of premised, you gave quite a classic argument, I suppose you would say, for locating counterfactuals of creaturely freedom as an object of God's middle knowledge, right? So the idea is that if God has made them to be true, then truths about how we act are set prior to and independently of us.
Yeah.
Would that be a fair sort of starting point for your argument?
Can you repeat that again? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. So suppose for a moment, just suppose I'm right. Suppose that the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. Well, okay, I just want to circle back to this. I'll come back to this in a second. Sorry, just getting weird notifications, which I can't deal with right now. Firstly, the general point is just because you might have an argument for supposing, you might have another argument for supposing that the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are an object of God's middle knowledge, right? Or that they are pre-volitional. You might have another argument for that. The point that I was simply making is it's a matter of logical validity. Simply because you have true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, it does not of itself follow that they are pre-volitional, right? You have to supplement that with additional argument. Now you might be able to do that.
Sorry guys, I'm gonna have to jump in because I guess I'm not following here. What is meant by pre-volitional?
Okay, so remember what we were saying before about that, take the proposition Andrew Harland-Smith exists. God knows that proposition precisely because he has made it to be true. Right? So that's a volitional truth. It's God's. I suppose you could say it's knowledge that God has in virtue of the exercise of his creative volition, right? Whereas when you're a Molinist, what you're saying is that you're saying that there's a subset of these truths, counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which are true prior to God's active creative volition, right? Is that a bit clearer?
Yeah, that's a lot clearer for me. So
yeah. So what John was saying, which was really interesting, because he's got this argument, you're trying to get this argument from the existence of true counterfactuals. Yeah. So you would have framed it as a conditional. If you were to frame it in standard form, the argument would go something like this. Premise one: if there are true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, then Molinism is true. There are true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, therefore Molinism is true.
Sorry, can I interject over there?
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't say that the conditional will be in the form of if there are true CCFs, then therefore Molinism is true. But I would just add the qualifier there, perhaps, that if God is omniscient, then the first premise will be that if God is omniscient, then he knows every and all true propositions. And the second premise is that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are true propositions. And therefore, the third one is God knows these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. I would say that's a way to logically put it in logical notation.
Yeah, but the argument is supposed to get you still to Molinism, right? So you'd have to use the premise that Andrew gave. That if God knows these CCFs, if he knows them, then Molinism is true. Otherwise, that's not an argument for Molinism.
Okay, yeah, I can concede with that then.
So what's the argument there from true CCFs to therefore Molinism?
Well, I think if you go from true CCFs, then you will say then
not just true CCFs, but God knows all true CCFs.
Yeah, if you have God knowing all true CCFs, are you saying that that's already a premise we can agree on?
Andrew?
I mean, yeah, I agree. I agree with that. God knows all true CCFs. Question is whether they're an object of his middle knowledge or not. Like that, because that's the distinguishing feature of being a Molinist. And I'm not clear that they are an object of God's middle knowledge, right?
Yeah, but then remember that once again, I'll just reiterate this, that when we talk about the counterfactuals, of course, you can say that counterfactuals can be an object of God's free knowledge rather than his middle knowledge. But then once again, counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, as Molinists understand them at the very least, has to be the prevolitional knowledge that supports libertarian free will. Which then, if you agree with this, then if you agree that at least that God possesses CCFs, these CCFs, knowledge of these CCFs, then Molinism is true by virtue of that. So I suspect at the very least that we have a terminology difference here in understanding counterfactuals. When I talk about counterfactual of creaturely freedom, I'm specifically mentioning about the counterfactual of creaturely freedom as Molinists understand them, and not perhaps as counterfactuals in general or just subjunctive conditionals in general.
So I'm noticing maybe we're talking past each other, because Andrew, your sort of argument, it looks like, is that these CCFs are not an object of God's middle knowledge. And so maybe we can get clear on what your argument is and why they don't constitute an object of God's middle knowledge. And maybe then we can start to look at how this is going to play out. Sure.
So John raised an interesting argument, sort of very briefly. And we started to talk about this very briefly. Just he raised an argument for locating the CCFs as an object of God's middle knowledge before, namely that if they are a product, and the argument went something like this, which is that if the CCFs are an object of God's middle knowledge, of God's free knowledge, then truths about how we act have been set prior to and independently of our free will, our free actions, right? So which is really interesting, because the principle there, the general principle there is that I outlined it in a written exchange between John and myself. I called it DT, or the dependence thesis. And basically the idea is that take for any person S and counterfactual of creaturely freedom C. If C is true, S has caused it to be true that C. So the idea is that if we are genuinely responsible for our actions, then we should be the source of, then we and ourselves should be the source of truths about how we act. And this is at the root of the argument that this principle is at the root of the argument that John was giving in favor of Molinism, in favor of locating the CCFs as an object of God's middle knowledge. But once you say that, so call it DT, so for any person S and true counterfactual of creaturely freedom C, if C is true, S has caused it to be true that C, then take a simple proposition about what at least three free agents are doing right now. So Cameron, John, and Andrew are having this cool discussion about Molinism. So that's a proposition about what free creatures would do in any given set of circumstances. Now, if you take that DT, what I call DT, if you take that to be true, then that proposition is true precisely because the three of us have caused it to be true. And if that's the case, then it's our actions now in 2018 that caused God, then sort of go back to the moment of creation, like the very first moment of creation. And we would say that God knew that proposition about what John, Andrew, and Cameron would do on, in August 2018. God knew that proposition to be true at that moment, and yet it was our actions here in 2018 that made them to be true, right? So there's still something like some 14 point some odd billion years to go before the conditions would arise that would make the proposition true. So it looks like, at least if you're a Molinist, and I don't think I have this problem, if it looks like there's a kind of retroactive causing of God's knowledge. So it looks like what we do here in August in 2018 causes God to know things back at the very beginning of time, at the very first moment of creation. So that looks like retrocausation.
Do you think that argument relies on A theory?
Yeah, I do. It definitely does. I don't shy away from that implication. I don't think that that's a particularly, at least among many Molinists, I don't think that's a very particularly controversial premise. I think most Molinists that I engage with are willing to grant me a theory of some kind.
Okay, so you mentioned this, what was it, DT thesis? Right?
Yeah.
Can you just, I'm gonna type it out here so that I can have it to recall.
DT, or I call it the dependence thesis, is that for any person S and true counterfactual of creaturely freedom C, if C is true, S has caused it to be true that C.
Caused it to be the case that C is true.
Yeah.
All right, so if C is true, S has caused it to be the case that C is true.
Yeah, and I would say that's really, I would say two things. I would say firstly that dependence thesis is really at the heart of any account of free will, whether you're a libertarian or a compatibilist about freedom of the will. That dependence thesis is at the absolute core of any theory about what it means to be morally responsible for our actions. So a determinist would just say that, yes, we cause propositions to be true, or we cause propositions about how we act to be true, but of course caused to cause them to be true, right? So that's what a determinist compatibilist might say. A libertarian is going to interpret that as saying we cause propositions to be true, but we are not caused to be caused to make them true, right? We are not caused to make them. Yeah. Is
Okay,
that
so yeah. No, the dependence thesis, I think I'm clear on. What's the argument from this to therefore
right?
Molinism is
Right,
false?
right. So I would just one more prefatory remark, which is just that I think that dependence thesis is actually inherent in Molinism as well, and I think it's inherent in the argument that John was giving for locating the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom as an object of God's middle rather than free knowledge. So that's just a that's I think it's inherent in Molinism. We can come back to that in a moment, but the argument from dependence thesis against Molinism is, okay, so suppose DT is true. Now take a proposition, call it P. P is the proposition that John, Andrew, and Cameron having this cool discussion in August 2018 about about Molinism, right? So that's a statement about what free agents would choose to do in any given set of circumstances, right? If DT is true, if that dependence thesis is true, then what makes P true is the fact that the three of us have respectively given our internal powers and dispositions. We have caused it to be true.
What do you mean by cause?
I just have a fairly intuitive understanding of it. I don't really have a sort of a particularly precise definition. I would say we cause it to be true. I'm not sure how to answer that question directly, to be completely honest with you. I would just
actually I was looking at the comments on the chat and YouTube, and someone was wondering, so I felt like it was.
Oh, sure, okay. I can't explicitly. I just have a fairly rough and intuitive understanding of causation, which I think is at least sufficient for present purposes.
I think John is chomping at the bits to get in here. Waiting for me to stop talking. Okay. All right, John, where do you want to go from here?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it's very good as a way of courtesy as well for me to, at the very least, just briefly restate the argument in my own language, in my own words, sorry, and see if this is representing you correctly. And basically, the argument goes like this, that the DT is the thesis that agents must be able to cause their own counterfactuals of creaturely freedom to be true. But then since agents do not cause their counterfactuals of creaturely freedom to be true, therefore they are not free in their actions. Will that be sort of accurate in saying the main place of your complaint, Andrew?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Okay. What I would say is since on Molinism they can't cause their own counterfactuals of creaturely freedom to be true. And I think you actually said at one point that they can't. Like, you actually said that these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, they're not true in virtue of God's creative decree, and they're not true in virtue of, in fact, we didn't even make them true. I think you might have said
right. Yeah, I said that we do not cause them to be true.
But yeah, to answer the question, I would say that's a fair accurate or a fairly accurate summary. So yeah, I don't think if you reject DT, I don't think you can have any plausible account of moral accountability.
Okay. Okay. So to respond to that a little bit, I think that at the very core of this issue, if I may just get to the core, is the question of, can there be brute facts about reality? And let me just make that clear. So where I was standing previously enough was I was saying that God could not have caused this, and we don't cause them because these were true. These counterfactuals of creaturely freedom were true before us. And Andrew replied by saying, yeah, but then if they were not caused by us and were not caused by God, then is it the case that these can be morally accountable? Now, I would say that I have two responses to that, and let me just say it here. First, I think I would say that whether or not someone is morally responsible for an action is not whether or not they cause the action. Sorry, they cause the propositions about their actions to be true. And let me give an illustration here. Suppose that I am flipping a coin right now in front of me. I'm flipping a coin, and then I'm flipping a coin right now. And before I flip the coin, I say, actually, I think the coin will flip heads. And I start flipping the coin, and it does flip heads. Now, I didn't know that previously, but it may have already been said that I also did not cause the proposition to be true. But then when the time arrives and I actually find that it's actually in heads, I don't just claim, well, I didn't make the proposition to be true, and therefore I wasn't free in doing my action. My point is here, propositions about our future and our past also were not caused by us, and yet we would readily say that we are free in doing them. We were free in doing them, and we will be free in doing them. And so in the same way, I take it that this counterfactual of creaturely freedom are brute facts describing what we would have done under different circumstances, but the fact that these are propositions and they're non-causal to our actions means that it really does not do anything to the fulfillment of libertarian free will. And let me make this clear. In order for a morally sufficient action to be, in order for an action to be morally sufficient for the agent to be responsible for it, one needs to claim, of course, one of it is that no prior event or nothing external to the agent previously had logically entailed or caused the action. And let me repeat that again. So one criterion in order for us to know whether or not an action is responsibly put into whether or not someone is responsible for an action is whether or not prior to the event of them causing the action, whether or not there were prior events that caused them to cause the actions, or whether or not there were prior event that logically entails them causing the action. That will be in saying that there's some sort of necessity here going on, that therefore it entails them doing that action. But the problem is, I don't see that it seems that this counterfactual of creaturely freedom being causal to the action to somebody. And of course, in that sense, then these propositions being contingent themselves merely describe your actions in the same way that past and future propositions describe your past and future actions without actually taking away your freedom, right? And I think this is my last response as well, and I have it on my notes here. We already had a written exchange about this. And of course, the main point here is that these propositions remain contingent. So whether or not they never necessitate the agent's actions, and in that sense, then they were not the logical entailment to the action, but then it was the agent themselves who acted as the first cause in bringing about a particular action. And if I may just add one last point here, one last point to make is that the agent does cause something. But then what the agent causes in reality is the action, not the proposition. The proposition merely describes. And so it seems that nobody, no Molinist, in my understanding at the very least, adheres to DT, because DT is just too radical, and perhaps it may even have the potential of rendering all our past and future actions to be not sourced in us in the same way, which clearly already indicates that this is a very radical statement that I think no Molinist, as far as my knowledge goes, no Molinists in my knowledge have been proponents of this thesis.
So it sort of seems like there's 3 points there. I'm sorry, I'm chomping.
Right? Yeah. Okay. I will focus on one point. What about that? Will that be okay for you?
Well,
okay.
No. It's okay. It's okay. But
Okay.
It sounds like there's 3 points. So there's
There were 3 points. There were 3 points.
Yeah. What about past action? What's the other two? Then there was this idea that cause the action but not the proposition.
Yes.
I don't follow the distinction there, but we'll come back. We'll put a pin in that. We'll come back to that. And in the third claim was that this is not something that Molinists adhere to.
Yeah.
I want to start with that because I think that's really at the core of it here. Because I actually
would you like to pursue that first, and then we go on to the other ones?
Well, I want to start with this idea that the dependence thesis is actually a feature of Molinism, because I want to sort of hang on. I'm just looking at my notes here. So there's a joint statement that John and I signed up before we did our written exchange. And there's part of that joint statement reads as follows, sort of, if the CCFs are a feature of God's free knowledge, they are no longer truths about what libertarian free agents would do. To the extent that the ultimate source of their truth lies in God's creative decree, their truth has been fixed independently of the relevant agent's causal powers. Right? Hence, it is anathema to Molinism to suppose that the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom have had their truth set prior to and independently of the relevant agent's causal powers. So that's to say, look, Molinism tells us that there's such a thing without freedom as free agents, or undermine our status as free agents. So according to its own lights, Molinism asserts something like the following proposition. 1, for any person S and true proposition or true CCF C, the truth of C is not independent of S's causal powers. That proposition 1 is identical to another proposition 1 prime for any person S and C, for any person S and true counterfactual of creaturely freedom C, the truth of C is dependent upon S's causal powers. Right? So,
sorry, can I interject here? Okay. Right here?
Yeah.
Okay, I can interject. Okay, so but remember, the first statement there does not logically entail the second. Just because the truth of these counterfactuals cannot be independently fixed does not entail that therefore the agent must be the one who does the action. As I mentioned previously, it may be the case that this is true by brute fact. That is to say, nobody causes them. Why can't that be a way out for a Molinist?
Okay, simply because if they're brute facts, then they are set independently of the relevant agent.
What do you mean by set? As in somebody caused them?
No, they might not be set. Well, it might not be that they're caused by any person or any set of conditions. It is that they are instead true independently of the agent. Now, I mean, I'll go back to that back to that joint statement. There's the key quote here is that to the extent that the ultimate source of so in that case, that's the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, to the extent that the ultimate source of their truth lies in God's creative decree, their truth has been fixed independently of the relevant agent's causal powers. So the problem is that the complaint is that if the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, if their truth has been fixed independently of the relevant agent's causal powers, that would undermine the relevant agent's status as a free agent, right? That's inherent in Molinism. So
it sounds to me like John rejects that, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, although this is a joint. I mean, I might be just cheating here, but there is a joint here, and I think they can get the same point.
No, sorry, it's fine. You can go ahead.
Okay. That's fair. I think you can get the same point. So the argument that John started to hint at before for locating the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom as an object of God's middle knowledge was premised on a very similar sort of complaint. And I would say that DT, whether he recognizes it or not, is somewhere in the offing of that argument. So the reason we say that the reason, if you're a Molinist, why you say that the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are an object of God's middle knowledge, is that if counterfactually they were an object of God's free knowledge, then God knows them because he has made them to be true. In which case, as John says, we would just have as John said earlier in the video, we would just have straight determinism, right? So
Yeah.
the complaint, yeah, right. So the complaint is that, the complaint just is that these counterfactuals cannot be set independently of the relevant agent's causal powers.
Well, sorry, I need to stop you there simply because I think it's very important to get this right. What my complaint was that there cannot be anything outside of the agent that causes the counterfactual of creaturely freedom to be true. Not that it can't be uncaused. That wasn't my point. At the very least, even if I may have inadvertently implied that, I am giving you the interpretation that I mean, namely that nothing outside of the agent can cause. But then if nothing causes the proposition, then I don't see why that should fall to my complaint.
I think maybe here it may help if we talk about this in terms of truth maker theory. Is your argument at all reliant upon that, Andrew?
Not as such, no. So a truth maker theory, like truth maker maximalism or an atomic truth maker, that's a general theory about what makes propositions true, right? This is just saying that I have a particular theory about what makes a certain subset of propositions true, namely the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. And I think what it is that what makes these propositions true is that they're grounded in the relevant agent's causal powers. And I don't follow the distinction that John drew earlier between causing the action and causing the proposition, because if I cause the action of Andrew Harland-Smith decided to participate in this exchange on YouTube with Cameron and John Limanto, I don't follow that distinction because then there's a true proposition about what I did in those circumstances, right? So the action, my very causing of the action to have this debate causes a true proposition. So I don't follow I don't follow the distinction, but I want to. So that's sort of addressing another thing. I do want to keep on with this, keep the pressure on as far as my claim that it's inherent that DT, the dependence.
Can I respond to that one point that you brought up just earlier before we move on? Because you just now brought up the point that you don't understand the distinction between you causing a proposition and you causing an action, right? And let me just make this clear. When I say that you cause a proposition, I mean causation in its primitive form. So I cause an action in its primitive form. But then how this relates to the proposition is because that event of me causing it makes true in the sense of truth making. So remember, it's important. This is vital because if you claim that somehow we have to cause all our propositions to be true, then you have to cause the propositions about your past actions to be true, your future actions to be true in the present. And nobody will say that. So that's just a way that I would make the distinction. If I cause an action, then I'm causing it in its primitive sense. Well, when I make propositions true about me doing something, then that's truth making. That's not causation. And philosophers have been very clear that truth making is never meant to be causation.
So, I mean, firstly, I'm a little bit confused as to where this complaint comes from about, well, on the dependence thesis, you have to say that we in the present cause past propositions to be true. I mean, I'm not sure how that. I'm sorry. I don't mean to get aggressive, but I don't, and I hope I'm not. But it sort of mystifies me as to how you get that from the dependence thesis. Partly because no, hang on. Just partly because what I would say is that there are propositions about what we did in the past, true propositions about what we did in the past, are grounded in our causal powers in just the same way that the dependence thesis would say, and statements about what we will do in the future. Well, these are grounded in our causal powers about what we will do in the future. I don't see how you can tie me to the. You've managed to tie me. I don't see how you can tie me to this understanding that somehow the dependence thesis is committed to this bizarro notion that I in the present cause all propositions about me past and future to be true. That's not what the dependence thesis says. I would just say you can add a temporal qualifier to it. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So I wrote it down, and you said for any person S and CCF C, if C is true, S has caused it to be the case that C is true. So I think that part of it, S has caused it to be the case, is maybe where maybe that's where the contention lies.
Yeah.
Okay, fair.
Can I at least spell out my complaint here, or at least my thoughts on just real briefly enough, just so to recapitulate what I was trying to say, just so before this gets even deeper. So remember, so we have that DT thesis, and you claim that this DT thesis is necessary for you to have moral responsibility, right? Now,
Sorry, could you just say that again? Just repeat that for me?
So this DT thesis is necessary for you to have moral responsibility. And so if, for example, you don't cause CCFs to be true, then it follows that you are not morally responsible for your CCFs. That's your complaint, right? Okay.
I think it's very.
Sorry?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think.
Okay. Well, if we can agree on that, then we have to also understand, if you at least try to understand me based on my complaint, I will also understand you based on your complaint. Your complaint here is that there are some, the proposition about our hypothetical actions that were not caused by us, and therefore we are not morally responsible because of it. But then I just now made the claim that you also in the present do not cause propositions about past actions. Now, you did say that you brought up an interesting point just now, because you said that this is grounded in causal powers. But remember, in the A theory of time, at the very least, these causal powers don't exist anymore. These causal powers don't exist anymore. And so all you are causing in the present is anything proposition about the present. You don't cause the propositions about the past in the same way that you cause your actions in the present, if I may ask you that, right?
So to come back on that, I would say two things. So firstly, it's not necessarily obvious that A theory is committed to the non-existence of the past. That's one particular kind of A theory called presentism, right? Which says that only the present exists. But you could have a growing block theory of time, which says that the future doesn't exist, but the past does. Okay, but having said that, it still doesn't follow that even if I am a presentist, what are the propositions about, right? What are the counterfactuals of preacherly freedom about? Is that, so take a proposition about what I did yesterday. So we're presentists. It's a proposition about what I did yesterday. Granted that these causal powers don't exist anymore. The causal powers today don't exist anymore because it's in the past, right? Okay, fine. But the fact of the matter is that the proposition is the proposition today. So for instance, I had orange juice for breakfast yesterday, right? Simple example. That proposition is a proposition about what I did, past tense. It's a proposition about what my causes were. It's not a proposition about what my causal powers are. So, and at the time that I made the proposition to be true, I would say that it was grounded in my causal powers. I made it true at the time, given my causal powers to have orange juice. Or there's a proposition at the moment. I'm having this discussion about the dependence thesis with John. I make it true in the present. Granted that, in a few minutes' time, those causal powers are not going to exist, but there's still going to be a true proposition about what my causal powers were, right?
So let me
And
see if
I
I
would-
can just jump in here and offer. Let's see what you think about this. So if we altered the dependence thesis just a little, if instead we say if C is true, well, for any person S in any CCFC, if C is true, S has either caused it to be the case in the present or in the past that C is true. What about that? Does that sort of avoid John's worry? You think?
Just say it again.
So S has either caused it to be the case in the present or in the past that C is true. That's the consequent.
Yeah.
Do you think that would solve?
Right. It might do. It might do. Is that all you might want to do is just add in some index it relative to time, right? So you just say there's propositions about what I did in the past that those propositions are simply statements about what my causal powers were and how I exercised them back then, even if those don't continue to exist. Or statements about the future would just turn out to be propositions of the kind like my powers may be such, or like supposing we've got foreknowledge, for instance, my causal powers may be such that I end up having I don't know, eggs for breakfast tomorrow morning, for instance, really simply. So I just think you could just index it relative to time, and you completely avoid this.
Okay, I have one question for Andrew. Andrew, I have one question for you. So would you agree then that what makes an action and what makes someone ultimately morally responsible for an action is because they, at the time mentioned, possess the causal powers to exercise the action in question? Do you agree with that?
I mean, yes, I do agree with that, and I think the consequence of that is that our causal powers cause a proposition to be true about ourselves.
Well, if that is the case, then why don't you also agree then that in the same manner, then our actions are also, we are also morally responsible for our actions in the present, given that at the time mentioned in the counterfactual of creaturely freedom, we would do those actions. We cause those actions at the time mentioned in the causal, with our causal powers. Or am I not?
I don't understand.
Okay. Let me just say that again. Okay, let me just say it again. So previously, I asked you the question. So do you agree that ultimately the reason why an action is someone is morally responsible for an action, is because at the time mentioned, they have the causal power, they have the causal means to perform the action in question. And you said yes to that, or you said yes to that, right?
I think at the time they performed the relevant action, they had the causal powers to.
Yeah, at the time. So ultimately, what makes an agent responsible for an action is that at the time mentioned in the proposition, they have the causal power to do the action. Right?
No. It's not the mere having of the causal power that makes them morally responsible. Not the mere having of the causal power. It's the exercising of the causal power in that way.
Right. They exercise the causal power at the time described in the proposition. And that's what ultimately, well, in the same way, why can't we also say that in CCFs, it is that at the time mentioned in the counterfactual of creaturely freedom, then person P exercises his causal power to do X. And that's ultimately what makes him responsible. Why can't that be the way in which we gain moral responsibility?
I don't think that I've said anything else. I mean, I don't think that I've necessarily rejected that. What I've said is that, I mean, you've tried to draw this distinction, which I still don't follow, between causing an action and causing a proposition, right? So if I mean, maybe causing is the wrong word here, but regardless, if I cause an action, so Andrew is
actions are not propositions.
no, yeah, granted. So I'm not saying that actions and propositions are identical. All I'm saying is that if for present purposes, I don't see the salience of the distinction, is perhaps what I could say. So there is a distinction. It's just that I don't see the salience of it for present purposes, largely because if I cause the relevant action, like Andrew had orange juice for breakfast yesterday, for instance. If I cause that action to come about, or I cause that state of affairs to be brought about, then there's a correlative proposition about that. Andrew had orange juice for breakfast that I made to be true, right?
Okay.
That's relatively straightforward. So the point is that it's still something that I have done in the present, which ends up, if you're a Molinist, acting backwardly on God's knowledge, right?
Okay.
And I'm not sanguine with that.
Right. May I respond to that, Cameron?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to address the first point that was brought up again. The first point is you don't understand the distinction between causing an action and making true a proposition. And let me make this clear again. When I say that somebody is making a proposition to be true, then this is a truth-making relation. And I'll explain this. I will explain this in this way. So when I say that something is true by truth making, I'm saying that it's true in virtue of such and such. So, for example, the truth maker for the proposition cars exists. The truth maker of that is the existence of cars. It is not as though the car exercises causal power such that now the proposition cars exists becomes true. So there is no causality that's going on when you make a proposition to be true, because, well, for example, you don't say that cars cause their action, exercise a causal power. You don't say that even, for example, negative existential propositions about non-existence of something. The non-existence of universe was not true by virtue of the non-existence of universe causing that proposition to be true. And so if we can at least agree on that difference, I want to make sure that we agree on this difference first, that when I cause an action, I cause it in the primitive sense of causation. But when I make a proposition to be true, then I am acting in such a way that I am doing an action by virtue of which the proposition is true. So it is not as though I cause the propositions to be true in the same way that perhaps toy cars don't cause the proposition toy cars exist, right? So at least we want to try to understand this one first and get this one true first before we move on. And I was wondering if my example of the cars there helped in illustrating what I mean.
I mean, okay, so fair enough. It might have been my mistake to use the word cause to be true, right? Okay, fine. But what I would still say is, I would say, like, the existence, for instance, of a toy car makes it true that this toy car is
right. Yeah,
it
absolutely.
True, right? But that's enough. That's enough to get something like an amended form of the dependence thesis across. Because remember well, now hang on. So the fact of the matter is, so take the proposition which I called P before, which is a truth about what the three of us are doing right now. This is a proposition, sort of, there's an action that we are causing to be true using your terminology. There's this action that the three of us are respectively doing. We're having this debate on YouTube, right? And that as a result, whether that's a causal notion of as a result or some other sort of correspondence notion, the fact of the matter is that there's still, as a result, there's still a true proposition about what the three of us are doing, which is made true by events and conditions occurring now in 2018, right?
Sure, I can agree with that, yeah.
So take that proposition P. That proposition P is made true by events occurring now, right? And yet, as from the very moment of creation, as from the very, very, very first moment of creation, God knew it to be true, if you're a Molinist, and yet the conditions making it true would not arise, would not come about for some 13 some odd billion years. Now, however old you think creation is. Now, the
6,000 years, I think, is what you meant to say.
Yeah, I'm just planting my tongue firmly in my cheek with that one. But
sorry to any young Earth creationists. I'm not going to go as far as what Craig says and saying he's embarrassed by you guys. I'm not embarrassed. I love you guys.
Yeah, but all I'm saying is that whatever notion you have of the relation, whether it's a causal notion or otherwise, we still want to say that as a result of our actions, there are true propositions that are true because of things in the present that, no, back up. Just again, I'll repeat what I said before. So P, that proposition about what the three of us are doing, that is a proposition that comes true as a result of things that the three of us are doing now in the present. And then this has a retroactive effect on this. Appears to, if God knew this from the very first moment of creation, it still looks like it has this retroactive effect on God's knowledge. And I'm not happy with the idea of retroactive causation, and I don't think you are either, John.
Well, I certainly am not endorsing backward causation here, but you can continue there.
Oh, let me actually jump in real quick. And we've amended the dependence thesis a couple times, so let me offer one more. And now we're going to put it in terms of truth makers, because that's, I think, what we just agreed on. So for any person S and CCF C, if C is true, S's actions are the truth maker for the truth of C.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. I like that. So yeah, you see, I'm perfectly willing to make amendments to things as need be.
So John, do you still reject that? Do you still reject it?
No, because well, perhaps we can apply that to subjunctive conditionals that happen in the actual world, right? For example, take our previous counterfactual. If Peter had been a follower of Jesus, then he would have he would have denied Jesus 3 times. Such a proposition really did happen. So we would say that that event is the truth maker of the proposition of the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. But then again, when we're talking about counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, we are also talking about counterfactuals that about free creatures who do not exist and will not exist. And so in that case, then I cannot agree with that, because there are these non-existent creatures. But I want to at least offer that there are still truth makers possible for this. I don't want to shy away from the notion of truth making here. I just want to say that if you allow the truth maker, for example, of a proposition about us doing what we're doing right now to be true from the past, even though in the past the concrete state of affairs does not yet exist, then you're conceding to the fact that it does not require a concrete state of affairs to make a proposition true. In that case, then why can't we say?
He's not conceding that. Andrew doesn't concede that, though.
Andrew does not concede. So Andrew, you have to say that so you will say then that truth making has to necessarily be made true by concrete state of affairs. Is that what you're saying?
Not truth making generally, but at least I think in this respect. I'm not sure about truth making generally, but at least in this respect.
Well, still though, you give the example of God knowing, having foreknowledge of us having this conversation in the present, right? Now, go back again in time, prior to creation, perhaps. I don't want to go to the debate of how long it was, but go back to that time. At that point in time, what made the proposition true? Is it the state of affairs that it will happen, right? Would you at least agree with that?
I don't.
Yeah.
Well, no. Hang on a sec. So the distinction between your view and mine, and I said at the beginning, because I do think that God's foreknowledge of our free actions is a result of His free knowledge, not as a result of His middle knowledge, right? So, it's not what I would say is.
Ask you something interesting. So would you say, like, okay, so you have this counterfactual of creaturely freedom, and before it happens, would you say that it just has no truth value? Because you're saying it's like that's what the action itself is, the truth maker for the truth of the counterfactual. Yeah. So before it happens, you'd have to. It seems to me that you'd have to be committed to the idea that there's just it has no truth value before it happens, because the proposition is always there.
Well, I mean, if it's a function, as I said, if God's foreknowledge of our free actions is an object of His free knowledge, then it's knowledge that He has because He's decided to make it the case, right?
So God has decided everything to be the case?
Yeah, I mean, I did say I'm a Calvinist at the beginning, so that would make sense. Excuse 1 second. Yeah, so what was it? Right. So, okay, so I mean, I take it that this is a point that you were starting to raise a little bit in our written exchange, John, which is, and for the sake of the audience, that was this general concern that this argument that I'm raising is not just an argument against middle knowledge so much as it is an argument against foreknowledge in general. And the answer that I would have to that is I would just say, well, no, that it's not obvious that follows just yet. Now it might, but there would need to be a bit more argument.
Okay, because can I give the argument? Can I give the argument? Okay.
Well, because what you would have to say is that, because what I can say is that this is not an argument against foreknowledge as such. This is an argument against, because on my view, the problem of backwards causation arises when you suppose that it's the occurrence of the action. So take the proposition P, that's a proposition about what the three of us are doing now. The proposition of backwards causation arises if you take it that the occurrence of the relevant actions, that our performing the relevant actions is what made it, is the basis of God's knowledge. If that's what you say, then yes, you do have this problem of backwards causation, right? But you could just say, well, no, the basis of God's knowledge of P is just God's making it the case that P, God's creative decision. In which case you don't have this, in which case you still have foreknowledge, but it's just not middle knowledge. It's not middle foreknowledge.
Let me just make a very quick question here. So are you a determinist Calvinist? Because Calvinism does not entail determinism, right? So do you think that God causes all propositions, all events, including counterfactual of creaturely freedom?
I'm not entirely made up my mind on that, but I'm perhaps more open to determinism. I have been more open to determinism in the last few weeks than perhaps in previous years. Yeah, but that's not necessarily, at least the debate at the moment, because it still seems to me that when you complain about determinism in that respect, you're still basing the complaint upon something like the amended dependence thesis. Right, so the complaint that the move that you're making goes from the move that's somewhere in the offing here goes something like, if the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are an object of God's free knowledge, then we are determined to be true. If they're determined to be true, they are set independent. They are set independently of us, right? And so it still looks to me. I still think that that complaint that I think you're starting to hint at is still relying on something like the amended dependence thesis.
But Andrew, I've already made this clear that what I meant, or my central complaint, is that there can't be external sources that causes the proposition to be true. Not that it's impossible for the proposition to be caused by anything except the agent, right?
Yeah, but okay. So do you follow this, right? So you're a Molinist, right? Do you
Yeah.
agree with the following statement? If the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are a feature of God's free knowledge, they are no longer they are no longer truths about what libertarian free agents would do.
Yeah.
Yeah, hang on. Trying to find. I'm just looking at my notes here. To the extent that the ultimate source of their truth lies in God's creative decree, their truth has been fixed independently of the relevant agent's causal powers.
Would you like me to give you my interpretation of that?
Well, I mean, it looks at the very least like you could extract what I called one before from that, which is that where is it? I mean, if the
Can I spool out my, at least give out my interpretation of that statement, just so this is clear between us? Okay, so where I agree with that statement is that there is, when it says fix. So once again, I'm gonna read it again right in front of you guys, right? If the CCFs are a feature of God's free knowledge, they are no longer truths about what libertarian free agents will do. To the extent that the ultimate source of their truth lies in God's creative decree, their truth has been fixed. Now, what I understand to be fixed there is cause, the word cause. And I think this seems to be intuitive. When we say fix, we mean something else has exercised a causal power to perhaps determine to determine something. So what my complaint there is simply that there cannot be anything independent of the agent that cause the propositions to be the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom to be true.
Yeah, but the
That's my
statement
interpretation.
to which the statement to which you agreed said, to the extent that the ultimate source of their truth lies in God's creative decree, their truth has been fixed independently of the relevant agent's causal powers. Now,
Right.
it follows from that. That one, for any person S and true CCFC, the truth of C is not independent of S's causal powers. That's what follows from
Right. Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which you've
Right.
agreed to.
Yeah. We can agree on that.
Right.
Okay.
Right. But then that statement is identical to P prime. But that statement is logically identical to P prime for any person, or 1 prime, pardon me, for any person S and true CCFC. The truth of C is dependent upon S's causal powers.
Okay. Can I point out one?
Those two statements are logically identical.
Well, I disagree with that, Andrew. I disagree with that. If, for example, let's go back here. So suppose we have a proposition, and the proposition it goes like this: not, and in bracket, in parentheses, P, not, and then in parentheses, P entails C, right? So that is to say that nothing outside of P, it's not true that something outside, sorry, actually it's not, and then parentheses, not P cause C. That is to say that nothing outside of P causes C, or nothing outside of P entails C. Let me repeat that again. Not, parentheses, not P entails C. That statement in itself is not logically equivalent, at the very least, with the statement that therefore P entails C. That is not logically valid. Do you get what I'm saying? Here's perhaps a more concrete example. More concrete example goes like this: just because there is nothing outside of P that causes C does not entail that therefore P causes C. Why? Because it may be the case that nothing causes C, nothing entails C. So why can't that be a possibility? And once again, I pointed out that wasn't logically consistent. And now my second argument is that why can't it be just the case that nothing causes C, not even P, not even anything outside of P? Why is that not a viable option to take?
So just to come back, I mean, what I would say is I would still say, like, the statement for any person, like, here are two propositions. So one, for any person S and true CCFC, the truth of C is not independent of S's causal powers.
Right.
Now, we agree so far that one, that statement follows from what we were saying about that in that joint statement, right? Now,
Right.
so for any person S and true CCFC, the truth of C is not independent of S's causal powers.
Right.
Restating that, I can restate that in another way. 1 prime for any person S and true CCFC, the truth of C is dependent upon S's causal powers. So not independent of and dependent upon, these are identical. These are identical. These are two the same thing.
But you're just repeating the refuted point that you brought up. I brought up the point that why not just say
it's been refuted so far. I mean, so far what we were saying is we were saying that one, for any person S and true CCFC, the truth of C is not independent of S's causal powers. Now that point we agree follows from what you were complaining about when you were complaining about from the nature of your complaint about the claim that the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are grounded in God's free knowledge. We agreed that that's what that one follows from that. Now, 1 prime is identical to 1. So do you want to maybe it would help if we wrote this down, Cameron?
Yeah. Perhaps that will help. So once again, I would like to point out the logical notation here is not in bracket, not P causes C. That's the essence of my complaint. That's as far as I am claiming that therefore nothing outside of P. It's not true that there is something outside of P that causes C.
But
that
do
is
you agree at least that not independent of and dependent upon are two ways of saying the same thing?
No, not at all. Because let me give you the argument like this. Why if we say that if we claim that something must be not independent to the person, then why can't we also say that nothing, not even the person causes that? That's a third option, wouldn't it be? That not even the person causes the action and not even anything outside of the person causes it. So this wasn't cause at all.
But then if it's not independent, right? So it is, so the truth of, so go back to 1. If we can we write this down, Cameron? This might really help.
Yeah,
so,
no, I have it here. I can repeat it. So for any person S and true CCFC, the truth of C is not independent of S's causal powers.
Right.
And to me that sounds like, I was going to say, it sounds like the dependence thesis that we amended. So if C is true, S's actions are the truth maker for the truth of C.
Yeah, it does. But what I'm saying is that I can get that. I think that 1, like, it falls out of the complaint that Molinists have about saying that the CCFs are a feature of God's free knowledge. So when you complain, as Molinists do, that about the claim that the CCFs are a feature of God's free knowledge, that complaint is invariably premised on something like 1.
Why?
Okay.
Maybe I'm not seeing it. Why?
Yeah.
Okay. So again, I'll go back to the joints again.
What if you don't appeal to the joint statement?
Well, I think that the joint
Molinism.
I think that the joint statement is relevant because it nicely encapsulates the sort of the nature of the complaint here.
Yeah, but can you at least my question is this: can you give the same example just by using the bare bone definition of Molinism that we have already agreed on?
I mean, the definition of Molinism that you agreed upon was that part of the reason if you're a Molinist, part of the reason that you locate the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom as an object of God's middle knowledge is because is because to say that they are an object of God's freedom, part of the purpose of grounding the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom in God's middle knowledge is because grounding them in his free knowledge would undermine our status as free agents, right? That's part of Molinism, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I can show that argument ends up being committed somewhere along the line to something like one, the one that we got Cameron to write down.
And you take it that one then entails one prime. That's the issue of the debate.
I didn't say that one entails one prime. I said that one and one prime are identical.
Okay, so you're even saying that they're the same thing. It's the same way. But okay, well, once again, I'll just like to point this out in logical notation, of course, and I'm just repeating my point previously. If you put this in logical notation, it goes in the form of not parentheses, not P entails C, because you're saying that nothing outside. It's not true that there is anything outside of P that causes C. Can we agree at least that that's what we're trying to talk about?
I don't see the significance of it. I mean, see, not independent. So independent. So what would it mean to say? Let's sort of reason this out. So the truth of C is independent of God's. The truth of C is independent of the relevant agent's causal powers, right? What would that mean to say? It would mean to say that the relevant agent's causal powers had nothing to do with the bringing about of its truth at C, right? We agree on that?
Yeah, we can agree on that.
So right. So not independent of means that the not independent of means that the relevance agent's causal powers had something to do with bringing it about that the proposition is true. That's what not independent of would mean.
Are you saying that that's the opposite of not the? Sorry, can you repeat that again? Your second one.
Okay, you're right. Fair enough. Okay, so let's. Okay, the proposition that we were looking at was one for any person S in true CCFC. The truth of C is not independent of S's causal powers. Okay,
right.
So take one subscript one, right? Just as an example, for any person S and true CCFC, the truth of C is independent of S's causal powers. Okay, just take that. Now, I don't think that's true, but let's just sort of try and pass out what that means. So sort of try and reason out what that means. It means that the relevant agent's causal powers, S, had nothing to do with the truth of C. That's what it would mean to say that S's causal powers, the truth of C is independent of S's causal powers. His causal powers had nothing to do with bringing it about that C is true. Right?
Okay.
Right. Okay. So now take the expression not independent. Yeah? Not independent. So now we've got another position, one subscript 2, which says something like for any person S we've actually just got normal 1. Sorry, pardon me. For any person S in true CCFC, the truth of C is not independent of. So not independent, we said that. So that would mean that S's causal powers did have something to do with bringing it about that C.
I'm okay, but then again, once again, at least I just want to posit this. At least I just want to posit this instead of us going around this again. I just want to posit this. I think that at the root of the issue is that you're saying that it must be the case, the opposite of the opposite of independent, and the word not independent means that somehow the agent must cause something. But why? Once again, why can't it be just that the agents do? It wasn't even the agents that caused that, right? It was just true by brute facts. I again, Cameron, perhaps you might want to interject here and see where it seems that my incredulity is about here.
So first, let me say this: we're almost at 2 hours. I can't believe it's gone that long already.
I know it's gone quick.
So we're gonna have to close it down here in a couple minutes.
Okay.
But I think maybe the way forward is to just go back to this amended dependence thesis, which is very similar. I think it's the same, actually. So for any for any person S and CCF C, if C is true, S's actions are the truth maker for the truth of C. But to me, that sounds a lot like what you're trying to express there with not independent of S's causal powers. That to me sounds like the same thing. So if that counterfactual is true, S's actions are the truth maker for the truth of C. And so we can avoid this talk of independent and dependent.
Yeah.
If we can just focus on that, then maybe we can focus on whether or not that dependence, that amended dependence thesis is true. Now, it sounded to me like, John, you agreed with that. But I think Molinists, the traditional sort of line that they normally take, in this situation is to deny any kind of truth maker theory about these counterfactuals.
Right. I think that's the usual. That's the stereotype on Molinism. But again, what
you're okay with saying you're okay with actually agreeing with that S's actions are the truth maker.
No, I'm okay with the truth maker theory being applied to Molinism, and that is to say that
do you agree with this amended dependence thesis?
Oh, right. Okay, with that amended dependence thesis, then no, I don't agree. I just simply agree with that truth maker theory needs to be applied to counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, but not with that amended thesis. No.
So what is the truth maker then?
The truth maker is the state of affairs of, for example, take the CCF. If a non-existent person S, so take that we have a person S, and this person does not exist, right?
Harry
and
Potter.
Will not exist.
Let's use Harry Potter.
Harry Potter, yeah. If Harry Potter were put, to be honest, I don't know what circumstance, just circumstance C, then Harry Potter will do X, right? So this guy doesn't exist. What is the truth maker of that? Well, the truth maker of that in reality is the state of affairs of Harry Potter doing X in circumstance C. That is called the disquotation principle. You remove from propositions to become state of affairs. And I think and I don't see why this should be an invalid move by Molinists.
All right, so let's turn it over to you, Andrew. And you're muted here.
Right. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah, as you said, we're sort of drawing near to the close of it. I still don't see any way around. The theory of truth making that I've given isn't a general theory of truth making. By the way, I just want to make that quite clear. I'm not sort of advocating a atomic truth making maximalism just because. Truth maker maximalism is a joke, generally, to be completely honest with you. But I can't see any way around it. If you're a Molinist, I can't see any way around supposing that something like the amended dependence thesis is true, particularly if you were going to complain about the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom being located in God's free knowledge. That's why we got into all the talk about, dependent and not independent and all of that. And if I just sort of like to summarize by saying, if you take the dependence thesis, even the amended dependence thesis to be true, then I think you end up with a problem with backwards causation. Now, there are various ways and moves that people can make to get around that. Like they could punt to Hexaidism, for instance, but Hexaidism is but we never really got it. We had a chance to get into that so much. So I still don't see a way necessarily around how you can, if you're a Molinist, reject even the amended dependence thesis.
Are you okay with using that as your closing statement, or do you want to say anything else before we move to John? Because I felt like that was a pretty good summary of.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. I mean, maybe you'd have to have like a host of discussions with other people, I think, to fully get through all of the issues. Because as I said, there are various other moves that I acknowledge that there are other moves that people could make. I mean, they can, as I said, I think Plantinga has this interesting line of argument, but you'd need to have a host of other discussions with other people about that to really sort of get that through. Otherwise, yeah, I'm fairly happy with that, with signing out there.
Okay, well, let's go to you, John, and just give us like a quick summary of what you think of where the discussion has gone and sort of where you're at.
Well, first of all, I think we were stuck there on trying to determine whether or not independent and dependent means something in a way or not. But once again, I will just invite the readers to go back to the logical notation that I've already summarized, and how the first is not identical to the second, at least in its logical notation. And unless Andrew can provide me with some other logical notation and some other valid methods of looking it up, then perhaps we can discuss it further. But I think with regards to, I would like to have a word with the amended amended dependence thesis as well, because once again, I think the issue that I'm having with this new amended dependence thesis is that it insists that only people that exist can be the one who make through their counterfactuals. Only people that exist, true counterfactuals can only be there with regards to people who exist. But then the problem with this dependence thesis is that it doesn't even apply when it comes to, for example, I will just say the same example of the past and future propositions. Past and future propositions were no longer perhaps made true by our action in the present. And even if you insist that perhaps they were made true or they will be made true, I think that Andrew's defense there still does not stand, because he still has not given a defense on why is it exactly that we should hold to such a kind of truth-making theory. Why not just say that instead that perhaps the truth, it's not as his actions exactly that act as a truth maker, but as long as there is a truth maker, then CCFs can be true. I don't see the jump between saying that there is a truth maker that makes a proposition true, that therefore now we have only someone's concrete action can make the CCFs true. And so with that, I think that summarizes my complaint to a large extent, and I don't think I have anything else to say.
Okay, guys. Well, thanks for coming on to Capturing Christianity. If you guys are watching, you want to learn more about what we do, then just head again to the website, Capturing Christianity. If you want to donate and help make sure that we continue to pump out this awesome content, go over to patreon.com/capturingchristianity. All right, until next time, we'll see you guys later.
Hey, may I say thank you to you, Cameron?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for hosting this.
Yeah, no problem. I guess Andrew's just going to be quiet about that.
Oh, yeah, no, sorry. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, hey, Andrew, I know we were a bit harsh there on each other, but we're still best friends.
No,
right?
Dude. Like I've done postgrad in philosophy, and I'm doing law. I can handle it.
Yeah.
I still love you, bro. I still love you.
I love you too, man.
All right, guys. We'll see you later.
I'll catch you later.